The worst thing my wife ever said to me was calm enough to slip through a half-open doorway like it belonged there. "He's just a substitute," Emily said, her voice soft, almost amused, like she was talking about a temporary seat at a dinner table instead of a human being. "Once Mark is back, I'll dump him." I stood in the hallway with a paper grocery bag cutting into my hand, frozen so completely that even the ice in the plastic milk carton seemed louder than my own breathing. The house was warm, the kind of warm that should have felt comforting, with the smell of garlic drifting from the kitchen and the low hum of the dishwasher running in the background. And for one strange second, that ordinary American evening felt so normal, it almost fooled me. Almost. I had come home early from work, dropped by the store, and taken the front steps two at a time because I wanted to surprise Emily with her favorite takeout and maybe an easy night on the couch. The kind of night married couples are supposed to have when life is steady and decent and nothing is broken. We had been living in the same two-story house on a quiet street outside Columbus for 6 years, with a white fence, a mailbox that tilted just a little to the left, and a maple tree out front that turned gold every fall. On paper, we looked like the kind of couple neighbors describe as solid. I worked long hours as a project manager for a commercial construction firm, and Emily had built a polished life for herself in marketing, the kind of job where people say your name in conference rooms and mean it. We had routines, bills, a mortgage, a dog that barked at every delivery truck, and a rhythm that made the world feel predictable. Or at least it had until that moment. I didn't make a sound. I just stood there, one shoe still on the hardwood runner, listening to the rest of her sentence as if my body had already understood what my mind refused to admit. Emily laughed lightly, that same laugh I used to think sounded like sunlight, and I heard another voice in the kitchen, a man's voice, low and familiar enough to make my stomach tighten. Mark. The name landed in my head with the weight of a stone. I had heard it before, of course, in small harmless ways that never seemed worth questioning. A former coworker, an old friend, someone who had moved away, or maybe someone she had once known better than she admitted. That was the lie I had allowed myself to keep because marriage is built on trust, and trust is easier to defend than doubt. But now I was standing here with a grocery bag in one hand, and the shape of my whole life changing in the space of a few whispered words. I looked down at the takeout containers pressed against the brown paper, at the condensation beading on the drink cups, at the stupid little detail of a plastic fork poking out the top, and I felt something inside me go very still. Not angry, not loud, just still. The kind of stillness that comes before a person realizes the story they have been living in is not the story they thought it was. Emily said my name next, but not to me. She said it like a private joke, like a placeholder, like I had already been reduced to something temporary and forgettable. And standing there in the quiet hallway of the house I had helped pay for, I understood one simple thing with perfect clarity. Whatever happened next, I was no longer going to be the man waiting in the background for someone else's life to resume. For a few seconds, I did not move. The paper bag hung from my hand while the kitchen lights spilled across the hallway floor, and I stood there trying to make sense of the sound of my own life breaking in a place that still looked completely normal. Emily kept talking inside, her voice calm and easy, the same voice she used when she was chatting with a friend over coffee, and that was somehow worse than if she had been shouting. There was no panic in it, no guilt that I could hear, just the careless comfort of someone who believed the truth was safe because it had not yet reached the right ears. I took one slow breath and looked toward the kitchen without stepping closer. I could see the edge of the island, the open refrigerator door, a glass set near the sink, and the back of Emily's head as she leaned slightly toward the counter. She was wearing the blue sweater I had bought her last winter, the one she always said made her eyes look brighter, and beside her I could see the shoulder of a man in a gray jacket, turned slightly away from me. Not a stranger. Not by the way she said his name. Not by the way her voice changed. Mark was not some distant memory or harmless old contact. He was there, in my house, standing beside my wife as if he belonged there. My fingers tightened around the paper bag, and I felt the cardboard edges press into my palm. The takeout boxes inside shifted just a little, making a soft sound that seemed absurdly loud in the quiet hallway. I should have walked in. I should have asked questions right then, demanded explanations, forced the moment into the light before it could hide behind another layer of lies. Instead, I stayed still, because some part of me needed one more second to understand what I was seeing. Emily laughed again, this time lower, and Mark said something I could not hear clearly. Their conversation had that relaxed, easy rhythm of two people who had already moved past the point of pretending. And that was the point when the air in the hallway started to feel different, thinner somehow, like the whole house had lost a little oxygen. I looked at the framed family photo on the wall near the stairs, the one from our anniversary trip to Lake Michigan, where we had stood on the shore with wind in our hair and smiled like a couple who still believed in forever. I had hung that photo myself. I had wanted proof that the life we built was real. Now it looked less like a memory and more like evidence of a mistake I had failed to see in time. Inside the kitchen, Emily said something softly, and Mark answered with a short laugh. I could not make out the words, but I did not need to. There are moments in a marriage when a person hears enough in the silence between words to understand everything. I had spent years assuming that love meant patience, that patience meant trust, and that trust meant giving someone the benefit of the doubt when life got busy. I had worked late. I had brought home groceries. I had fixed the porch light, taken the dog to the vet, and made coffee when she had morning meetings. I had done all the things good husbands do when they think consistency will protect a relationship from drift. But standing there now, listening to Emily speak with the kind of warmth she had not given me in months, I understood that some distance does not arrive all at once. It builds quietly, one small lie at a time, until one day a man is standing in his own hallway holding dinner in a paper bag while his marriage belongs to somebody else. Mark did not look surprised to see me, which told me more than any explanation could have told me. When I finally stepped into the kitchen, the room went quiet in that sharp, uncomfortable way that happens when a private conversation has been interrupted by the one person who was never supposed to hear it. Emily turned first. Her smile came late, thin and carefully shaped, the kind of smile people use when they are trying to hide the exact thing they know they should not be hiding. "You are home early," she said, as if that detail mattered more than the fact that her voice had only moments ago been warm enough to build a second life inside my house. Mark shifted his weight beside the counter, one hand resting near a coffee mug that was not his, looking less like an old friend and more like a man waiting for a ride. I set the grocery bag down slowly on the island, one carton at a time, because I needed my hands to do something ordinary while my mind tried to keep up with what my eyes had already accepted. The takeout containers were still warm. The rice steam had fogged one of the lids. I remember noticing that because my brain kept reaching for small details, as if the shape of a dinner order could somehow make the larger picture easier to bear. Emily glanced at the bag, then at me, then back to Mark. There was a fraction of a second where she seemed to consider a lie, but whatever story she had prepared dissolved before it could leave her mouth. That was when I understood how long this had been going on. Not from one sentence. Not from one meeting. From the ease of it. From the way she stood in my kitchen without flinching. From the way Mark stood there too, like my home had already been adjusted around him. I kept my voice level when I asked, "How long has he been coming here?" It was not even the question I wanted to ask. I wanted to ask why she had spoken about me like a placeholder, why my own house felt suddenly unfamiliar, why every memory I had was now being rewritten in real time. But I asked the smaller question first, because I could feel my heartbeat pushing against my ribs, steady and strong, and I knew that if I let myself speak too fast, I would lose control of the only thing I still had left. Emily crossed her arms, not defensive exactly, but closed off in a way I had not seen from her before. "It is not what you think," she said, which is a sentence that always means it is exactly what you think, only worse. Mark looked at the floor. That told me enough. He did not interrupt. He did not defend himself. He did not act confused. He just stood there with the uncomfortable patience of someone who had already accepted the role he was playing. And in that instant, something in me settled into place. I had spent too many months explaining away the small distance between us, too many evenings assuming stress had done what honesty should have done instead. But now, with the kitchen lights humming above us and the smell of dinner cooling on the counter, I could see the shape of the truth very clearly. Emily had not drifted into this by accident. She had been building toward it, quietly, deliberately, and I had been standing in the middle of my own life, helping carry the groceries, while she turned me into an afterthought. The strange part was that I did not feel the urge to raise my voice. I thought I would. For years I had believed that if the worst day of my life ever came, it would arrive with shouting, slammed doors, maybe something broken in the sink or on the floor. Instead, it came quietly, in a kitchen with warm food sitting untouched on the counter, and two people who had apparently decided my life could be discussed like a schedule change. I looked at Emily, then at Mark, and neither of them looked like they were suddenly ashamed. They looked like people who had rehearsed this moment in private and were now annoyed that I had arrived before the conversation was finished. That was the part that kept replaying in my head as I stood there, because it told me everything I had not wanted to know. This was not confusion. This was not a mistake. This was a decision made over time. My mind started moving backward, pulling up memory after memory that had seemed harmless when they happened. The late nights when Emily said she was staying after work for team meetings. The dinners where she seemed distracted, smiling at her phone instead of the man sitting across from her. The Saturdays when she needed space and said she was just tired, just overloaded, just not in the mood to talk. At the time, I had accepted each one on its own. That is what trust does. It turns 100 little questions into one bigger excuse. I remembered a night in late summer when we had driven down to the lake in our old SUV with the windows cracked and the radio low. Emily had leaned her head against the glass and said, almost casually, that some couples grow together and some couples simply grow beside each other. I had laughed then, because I thought she was being philosophical. Now I was not so sure. I remembered another afternoon at the grocery store when she had stared at a display of picture frames and said people keep buying things to prove they have a life worth remembering. At the time, I thought she was tired. Now I wondered if she had already started looking at our life like something temporary. Mark had entered the picture slowly, so slowly that I probably would not have noticed if the changes had not already been happening inside Emily. He used to be the kind of name she mentioned in passing, a former colleague, a man she had once worked with on some marketing project I never paid attention to. There was always some simple explanation. There always is, until there is not. I could see now how carefully she had kept him close without making it obvious. A message here, a favor there, a mention of coffee, a recommendation, a memory from years ago. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would have made an honest man sound an alarm. That was what made it worse. She had not jumped. She had drifted. Or maybe I had been the only one drifting while she stayed exactly where she wanted to be. I stood in my own kitchen, looking at the woman I had built a home with, and all the ordinary details around us seemed to lose their meaning. The magnets on the refrigerator, the chipped bowl by the sink, the church bulletin tucked under a fruit basket. Every object looked like it belonged to a version of my life that had already ended without my permission. And for the first time, I started to understand that the deepest betrayal is not always the thing you catch in the act. Sometimes it is the long, quiet process of being replaced while everyone still expects you to smile and call it normal. I did not ask Mark to leave right away. That is the strange truth of that moment. I just stood there in the kitchen, listening to the soft buzz of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock above the doorway, while the three of us pretended for a few seconds that this was still a conversation between reasonable people. Emily folded her arms tighter, as if the motion could hold the room together. Mark glanced at me once, then at her, then toward the hallway, like he had already learned that silence was safer than honesty. I remember noticing the sunlight on the counter, the half-open takeout bag, the condensation sliding down a glass of water that nobody had touched. Everything looked so ordinary that it almost insulted me. Emily finally spoke first. She said my name in that careful tone people use when they want to sound calm while they are asking you to accept something you have not agreed to. She told me I was making assumptions, that I had walked into the middle of a harmless conversation, that Mark was only there because he had been helping her with some work issue she did not have time to explain. It was such a thin explanation that I almost admired the courage it took to say it out loud. Mark did not help her. He did not nod. He did not add a word. He just stared at the tile floor, one hand in his pocket, his shoulder tense under the gray jacket. That told me more than any defense could have. People who are innocent speak too fast. People who are guilty speak carefully. I looked at Emily and realized she was not trying to save the truth. She was trying to save the version of the truth she thought I could still be made to swallow. And all at once I remembered the little moments that had never fit together until now. The phone turned face down on the table. The sudden change in perfume before a dinner out. The new habit of stepping outside to take calls. The way she had started saying things like, "You are always so busy," in a voice that sounded less like a complaint and more like preparation. I had worked hard for our life. Not in the dramatic way people brag about, but in the ordinary American way that wears a person down slowly. Early mornings, long commutes, email after email, budget meetings that stretched past sunset, repairs on the house, groceries on the way home, the quiet, dependable work of being present. I had thought presence mattered. I had thought showing up was enough. Standing there now, I could see how little all of that had protected me from a story Emily had already started rewriting. The kitchen felt smaller by the second, not because anybody moved, but because the lie had room to breathe and the truth did not. I set my hands on the edge of the island so they would stop shaking, and I asked one question that I already knew the answer to. Is this why things changed between us? Emily looked at me for a long moment before she answered. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She only said, "It is complicated," which is what people say when they want time to keep covering for them. That was when I understood the real pattern. This was not a sudden crack. It was a slow redesign, a new center of gravity, a life she had been building in increments while I remained loyal to the older version of us. And in the quiet that followed, with Mark still standing there like a shadow that had found a seat, I made my first clear decision of the night. I was done trying to prove that I belonged in a room where I had already been made optional. After that first decision, everything in me slowed down. I stopped trying to argue with the room, stopped trying to force Emily and Mark into admitting something they had already admitted by the way they stood there, and I simply looked around my own kitchen as if I were seeing it for the first time. The refrigerator door still had our calendar on it, with my dentist appointment on Thursday and Emily's work dinner on Friday, both written in the same blue ink we had used for years. There was a magnet from the Grand Canyon holding a receipt in place, a mug ring on the counter near the sink, and a small stack of unopened mail by the fruit bowl. Ordinary things, familiar things, and yet the whole place felt different now, as if the air itself had changed shape. Emily seemed to notice that I was no longer reacting the way she expected. Her expression shifted from guarded to uneasy, like someone who had planned for anger but not for calm. That was the part she did not know how to handle. Not every man shouts when his trust is broken. Some men just get quiet enough to hear the truth moving around them. I asked her one more question, and this time my voice came out steadier than I felt. How long has this been going on? Mark exhaled through his nose, almost a laugh, but not quite, and Emily looked at him before looking back at me. That pause told me what I needed to know. It had been long enough for them to practice silence. It had been long enough for them to believe they could control the shape of the story. Emily finally said it had started a while ago, which was not an answer so much as a confession dressed up as one. A while ago. That was all she gave me. No dates, no honesty, no real account of how my wife had turned our marriage into a waiting room. I nodded once, not because I understood her, but because I understood enough. I thought about the weekends she had stayed late at work, the meetings that lasted past 7, the business trips she had extended by one night without much explanation. I thought about the dinners where she barely touched her food, the time she sat beside me on the couch without really being present, the casual way she had begun building distance between us while I kept calling it stress. The strange thing was that none of it looked dramatic in memory. That was what made it dangerous. It was all so small. A missed glance, a distracted answer, a private joke I was not included in, a phone screen turned away, a conversation cut short. That is how trust disappears most of the time, not in one crash, but in tiny pieces that are easy to excuse until one day they are too many to ignore. I turned slightly and looked at the hallway leading to the front door. My groceries still sat on the island. The paper bag had collapsed on one side, and the boxes inside had started to cool. I should have felt angry at the wasted dinner, but what I felt instead was a clean kind of clarity. For months, maybe longer, I had been making myself smaller so the marriage could stay comfortable. I had been bending around Emily's moods, her distances, her silences, hoping that consistency would eventually repair what honesty should have protected. But now I could see it plainly. They had not simply hurt me. They had moved me out of the center of my own life and expected me to remain grateful for the space left behind. I looked at Emily, then at Mark, and I knew I was done waiting for anyone in that kitchen to tell me the truth I had already found. I did not raise my voice when I asked them to step back from the counter. I did not point, and I did not say anything dramatic, because by then I had already crossed some line inside myself that made all the old reactions feel useless. Emily stood by the sink with her arms folded so tightly across her chest that her shoulders looked tense enough to hurt, while Mark stayed near the kitchen doorway like he was trying to decide whether leaving quickly would make him look guilty or simply intelligent. The whole room felt suspended, waiting for me to react in the way they had probably rehearsed in their heads. Instead, I reached for the grocery bag, took out the cold items one by one, and placed them on the counter with a strange kind of calm. Milk, takeout, fruit, a bottle of sparkling water Emily liked when she was pretending to be in a good mood. Each sound was small, but the silence around it was louder than any argument could have been. Emily watched me carefully, as though the way I handled the groceries might tell her whether I was about to break. That was when I realized she still did not understand me at all. She had seen me as patient, dependable, maybe even too willing to forgive, but she had never really seen what happened when my patience ran out. I looked at the kitchen clock. It was a little past 7. Outside, the sky had already turned the soft gray blue that comes before evening settles in, and the houses across the street were beginning to light up one by one. That normal American neighborhood glow, the one that usually made our street feel safe and familiar, now felt distant and almost theatrical, like the world outside had no idea what had just ended inside this house. I asked Emily to tell me one thing honestly, and my voice stayed even enough to surprise me. I asked whether Mark had been in our home before. She hesitated. Not long, but long enough. Then she said yes, which was worse than if she had tried to lie. Mark looked away, jaw tight, and that small movement confirmed what the answer had only begun to reveal. This was not new. This was not a momentary lapse. This was a pattern, a habit, a second life built close enough to mine that I should have noticed, but did not. I remember thinking about all the times I had come home tired and grateful for a quiet evening. All the times Emily had said she was too busy to talk. All the moments I had accepted distance because I believed decent people did not keep score in marriage. I had mistaken restraint for loyalty. I had mistaken habit for trust. And now I was standing in my own kitchen, surrounded by objects I had chosen and paid for, while two people looked at me with expressions that belonged to a conversation I had not been invited into until it was nearly over. Emily finally said she never meant for it to become this complicated. That sentence told me everything. No one ever plans for a lie to get large enough to swallow a house. It starts with permission, then silence, then convenience, then a story so carefully kept that it begins to feel normal to the people telling it. I set the last grocery bag aside and looked at her without blinking. I was not yelling. I was not pleading. I was simply measuring the distance between the life I thought I had and the life that had been happening without me. And in that quiet space, I understood that the next move belonged to me. By the time the last grocery bag was empty, the kitchen no longer felt like a place where dinner might happen. It felt like a room where a decision had been made and no one had the courage to name it out loud. Emily stayed near the sink, silent now, and Mark had not moved from the doorway, as if he understood that the only thing keeping this moment from collapsing entirely was my refusal to give it a shape. I looked at both of them and realized something that should have been obvious much earlier. They were waiting for me to either explode or excuse them. Either reaction would have made their version of the story easier to survive. I gave them neither. Instead, I turned toward the counter, picked up the bottle of sparkling water, and set it back down with the same calm I had used on the groceries. That small motion seemed to unsettle Emily more than any raised voice could have. She asked me to sit down, to talk, to not make any decisions while I was upset. It was almost hard not to laugh, because the decision had already begun long before she noticed it. I told her I was not upset. I told her I was seeing things clearly for the first time in months. That was the truth, and the truth had a way of making the room feel colder without touching the thermostat. I started thinking through the last year with a clarity that came from being hurt in a way too deep for panic. The business trip to Indianapolis she extended by one night. The phone calls that always came when she stepped outside on the porch. The growing habit of keeping her screen turned away from me. The sudden interest in quiet weekends that used to matter less to her. Each memory fit now, not as proof of one dramatic betrayal, but as evidence of a life quietly rearranged while I was still paying the mortgage and taking out the trash and asking if she wanted coffee in the morning. I had spent so much time trying to be fair that I never noticed fairness had become a trap. I had given her room to breathe, room to work, room to think, room to be herself, And somewhere inside that generous space, she had built a separate doorway and invited someone else through it. I could hear the faint sound of a lawnmower somewhere in the neighborhood, the kind of ordinary suburban noise that usually meant a Friday evening was settling in. A dog barked 2 houses down. A car door closed. Somewhere, somebody was probably setting a table or checking the oven or asking a child about homework. Life was continuing exactly as it always had outside these walls, which made the stillness inside our kitchen feel even more surreal. Emily finally said, in a voice thin enough to almost disappear, that she never meant to hurt me. That sentence landed with less weight than she probably expected, because by then I had already learned that intention is not the same as innocence. People say that when they want mercy without accountability. I nodded once and looked at Mark. He was still avoiding my eyes. That told me more than anything else. Men who are truly out of place usually know enough to leave quickly. Men who stay are usually counting on someone else to make the scene easier for them. I took my keys from the counter, the same keys that opened the front door, the garage, and the small life I had once thought was enough to hold together a marriage. Then I looked back at Emily and said, very calmly, that I was done carrying the version of this story she wanted me to accept. For the first time all night, nobody answered. And in that silence, I understood that the next chapter was already mine. For a long moment after I said those words, nobody in the kitchen moved. The refrigerator kept humming. The wall clock kept ticking. Somewhere outside, a car passed slowly down the street, and the sound faded into the evening like nothing important had happened at all. That was the strange part. Life outside our house did not stop just because mine had changed shape. Emily stood near the sink with her hands resting on the counter now, as if she needed the support. Mark finally looked at me, but only for a second, and there was something uneasy in his face that told me he had expected anger, not distance. I think that was what surprised both of them most. I did not raise my voice. I did not beg. I did not try to win an argument that had already been lost in silence months ago. I just stood there and realized I was done participating in a version of my life that required me to pretend not to see what had been happening right in front of me. Emily said my name again, softer this time, and asked if we could talk tomorrow when things were calmer. I almost told her that calm was not the issue. Clarity was. But I did not need to say it. She could see it in my face. I took my keys from the counter, then my phone, then the grocery receipt that had fallen beside the fruit bowl. Such a small piece of paper. Such a small record of a night that had turned into a line I would never cross back over. I walked toward the front door, and neither of them stopped me. That told me everything. If they had wanted to fight for the truth, they would have done it earlier. If they had wanted to choose honesty, they would not have waited until I caught them standing in my kitchen like a second family trying to borrow my life. I stepped outside into the cool air and closed the door behind me. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always did. Porch lights glowed. A sprinkler clicked somewhere in the distance. A dog barked from a backyard 2 houses down. But I felt different walking to my truck. Lighter, but not because I was happy. Lighter because I was finally carrying only what was mine. I sat in the driver's seat for a few seconds without starting the engine and looked at the house through the windshield. From the outside, nothing in it would have looked unusual. There would be dishes in the sink, lights in the kitchen, and 3 lives quietly splitting apart in a place that still looked like a home. I thought about every compromise I had made, every time I had chosen patience over suspicion, every moment I had told myself that being a good man meant absorbing more than I should have. And I understood then that dignity is not loud. Sometimes it is just the decision to stop standing in a room where you are no longer being treated as equal. I started the truck, backed out of the driveway, and drove away without looking back. Not because I had no feeling left, but because I had enough feeling left to know I deserved better than being a substitute in my own marriage. If this story made you feel something, I would love to know what part stayed with you the most. And if you want more stories with that same slow burn, quiet tension, and emotional twist, make sure you subscribe so you do not miss the next one.